folks with the Archaeological Society of New Jersey for helping to put this together. And again, thank all of you for listening in on the presentation. Mark Nonestied, a division head with the Middlesex County Division of Historic Sites and History Services, and Middlesex County historian. For many decades, the residents of South River, New Jersey, passed down stories that a small plot of land in the corner of Washington Monumental Cemetery contained victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic. In October of 2018, at the 100th anniversary of the height of the pandemic, the Middlesex County Office of Arts and History, in partnership with the South River Historical and Preservation Society and the Washington Monumental Cemetery Association, with funding from the New Jersey Historical Commission, decided to put this story to the test and commissioned a ground-penetrating radar survey. The results were rather stunning. There were almost 400 unmarked graves of individuals buried in several rows. The discovery led to extensive news coverage in the New York, New Jersey region. But who were these people, and did they all die from the pandemic? This is an attempt to answer those questions. Washington Monumental Cemetery is located in South River, New Jersey. It was incorporated in the mid-1800s as a garden-style cemetery, and its location on Hillside Avenue afforded views of the surrounding area. It quickly became the regional burial ground for both ends of the economic spectrum. The well-to-do chose plots on the top of the hill where they erected large monuments, while many newly arrived immigrants purchased plots in the lower ends and erected modest or homemade markers. In the southwest corner, at the bottom of a hill, there's a void with a smattering of grave markers, and you see that sort of center of the screen. I've outlined it in black there. This is the section that for many decades, the residents of South River thought that victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic were buried. And I want to add that this was an oral history that was rather strong. And it's a oral history that spans many different generations over many decades, and it even permeates today among a younger population. In fact, it was rather interesting when the news articles came out about the discovery here. Many of the online papers, readers had an opportunity to put their comments in. And there was a comment from a young millennial, which was rather sarcastic, but I got a kick out of it. He said, in short, that this really wasn't a discovery. We had known about this all along. And I thought that that was a rather powerful comment, because it just shows you how much of a tradition this has been passed from generation to generation to generation. And I think that's an important part here. The smattering of surviving markers in this section are simple, and they reflect really the cultural background of mainly newly arrived Eastern European immigrants. And it's a contrast to the larger monuments that are found throughout other sections of the burial ground. Some of these markers are in Russian and Hungarian. They are homemade varieties of cast cement, and again, certainly speak to the cultural diversity of South River and the surrounding towns. And this here is one example of a cement cast concrete marker that can be found in that section. One of the earliest photographs of this section was taken in the 1890s, and it shows what appears to be the beginning rows of this section of the cemetery. And judging by the markers that you can see in the image, its main use was for an immigrant population. So if you look in towards the background there and you see the crosses, that's the beginnings of the area that we're talking about. And those are crosses that they may be made out of wood, concrete that's painted white, or iron that's painted white to mimic marble markers that were the predominant stone material at the time. But again, markers that are speaking to an Eastern European immigrant population. It also appears that this area was mainly undeveloped and overgrown. So if we can kind of continue down the hill there, where you can see the overgrown section in the background, that's the area that really has yet to be developed when this photograph was taken in the 1890s. I suspect that there are isolated burials in there somewhere, because the surviving markers that can be found there, there are some that predate the photograph here. I also want to note that some folks have described this as a pauper burial ground, and I just kind of want to make a distinction or clarify and give my opinion about what I feel the section is. When I hear the word pauper burial ground, I often associate that with folks that are, they're wards of the state, of the government. They're folks that are so destitute that they rely completely on the government for their final burial. I believe those that were buried here were people that were still hanging on to the last rung of the economic ladder. So, they were sort of the newly arrived immigrants, working class, and those of a less financial means. So we'll speed up here to what it looks like today. You can see much of this section has been infilled with markers from the 20th century. If we continue down the declivity of the hill, that's the area where the void is today. The ground penetrating radar survey was done by Dr. Tim Horsley of Horsley Archaeological Prospection of Illinois. He was contracted to do what is a non-intrusive ground survey, and it took place in October of 2018. And it consisted of both the void area, which is off in the background, and an adjoining section that contained family plots, which you can see here. We'll talk a bit about in a moment about why he did that. So this is the area that had where we knew there were burials, where there are existing markers. And then this is the section that's the void area. And you can kind of see again that smattering of markers. And he's laying a grid system out over this site to conduct his work. And here's Mr. Horsley going back and forth with his equipment. It's running back and forth on that grid system that's being laid out. And in his words, GPR, ground penetrating radar, measures ground disturbances. So air pockets created by burials would show up as anomalies in the data. And his quote, burials appear as roughly rectangular anomalies that are caused by air spaces from caskets and disturbed soils in the grave shafts. There's some continuing that work. The results were rather stunning. There were almost 400. We count roughly about 378 unmarked graves were revealed of individuals buried in several rows. And if you look very carefully at the raw data here, you can see those marks showing up in lines. I'll move ahead to the next slide, which shows a simplified interpretation map that's a bit easier to read using this raw data here. You can see that right away. The dark rectangular areas are probable burials with the possible in gray. If you look to the north to the top, you can see that family section, which is much more orderly, the burials within family plots with headstones. And again, if we go to the south to the lower part of the screen, we can see those rows and rows and rows of mainly unmarked burials. Which also should be noted that these burials run right up to, and in some cases, it looks like they're continuing outside the area of our scope of work. So it's quite possible that there are burials continuing outside the scope of work here. And in hindsight, we probably should have extended it a bit. But you can see, especially towards the bottom right of the screen, some of those blocks right up against the boundary of where the work took place. The discovery led to extensive news coverage in the New York area. All the major New Jersey media outlets covered the story, as well as the New York affiliates of CBS News and NBC. There were other news organizations that ran articles as well, some with some rather interesting titles, such as this one, 400 bodies found in unmarked tombs in the South River, apparently turning our investigation here into an underwater archaeology project. I want to give an overview of the of the 1918 pandemic. Just sort of a brief overview to put this all in context. There are many books on the subject for those that want to learn more. One such book that has been useful in framing this project is titled The Great Influenza, The Story of the Deadliest Pandemic in History. It's by John M. Barry. It was a New York Times bestseller. And Mr. Barry has been quoted much recently in reference to the current crisis that we're faced and how that relates to the 1918 pandemic. But overall, it was an outbreak of the influenza virus that was estimated to have killed 50 million people worldwide. It's estimated that some 500 million people came down with the virus, got sick from it, and that roughly 50 million perished. The movement of people during World War I compounded the problem. It helped spread the influenza virus around. And it was a pandemic that came in various waves and stretched over 2 years. The deadliest wave was the second wave that primarily was the month of October. That was the worst of it. And it's estimated that roughly 2/3 of the deaths took place within that month. It was rather devastating. The influenza impacted Middlesex County as well, as towns were placed under quarantine, as schools, churches, theaters, and saloons were all closed. Newspapers ran headlines on the grim death toll of pneumonia, which was the most common cause of death from contracting the influenza virus. In Middlesex County, the explosion of the Gillespie Shell Loading Company, which was a large World War I munitions factory in the Morgan section of Sayreville, compounded the influenza problem as thousands of refugees fled the area, with many congregating in emergency shelters, coming in close contact with other people and spreading the flu. And you can see the image there on the front page of one of the local newspapers of some of those refugees. Also of note, look at the article on the right-hand side of the screen. A great parade to raise funds for one of the World War I Liberty drives. So, doing all the things you shouldn't be doing during the height of a pandemic. In New Brunswick, the local newspapers reported that in that city, all the vaults in the city cemeteries are piled high with coffins of the unburied dead, the number of grave diggers being inadequate to prepare the graves. It was a pandemic that affected all ends of the social spectrum. Both the current mayor and the former mayor, Mayor Farrington of New Brunswick, died during the pandemic. And if we zero in on South River, the 1918 Industrial Directory of New Jersey lists the population of South River at 7,650. And it consisted of 750 people of Polish descent, 500 Hungarians, 500 Russians, 200 Italians, 10 Lithuanians, and 250 Austrians. South River was a blue-collar, working-class community, with the labor force being made from European and Eastern European immigrants. The primary industries in South River included both the ceramic industry, the productions of brick, and the textile, mainly embroidery factories. The latter helped to develop a piecework or homework system that would contribute to the spread of the pandemic, as families and workers crowded into housing to produce textiles that were finished off by the factories. So it's really the sort of tenement style of housing where you have families crowded into these homes that are producing piecework that's then being purchased by the larger factories, and that's going to contribute to the spread of the pandemic. This is a photograph of the Harriman Occam factory, one of the largest employers in South River, and one that contributed heavily to the homework system. As noted, South River and really many of the surrounding communities, Sayreville was in the same predicament, New Brunswick, many of the surrounding communities at this time were hit especially hard during the pandemic. At one point, as the article on the top states, that 50% of the school children were homesick, and that eventually the schools were closed and the town was placed under quarantine. Really a contrast to what's going on with the current crisis. I live in East Brunswick. My children go to the East Brunswick school system, and when a single person came down with the coronavirus in East Brunswick, they shut the schools down immediately. So you can see the difference between how these were handled historically and today. On October 14th, 1918, the Board of Health in South River, after canvassing the neighborhood, reported 642 cases. And they noted that in some instances, the entire family was ill. And in the days that followed, newspaper accounts would raise that number to some roughly 2,000 cases. Now, one of the few images that speaks to New Jersey and the pandemic happens to be an image that was taken in South River. And that's the image, the photograph there of the wagon with a coffin in the back. It shows a victim of the influenza pandemic being conveyed to the cemetery. And the caption on the back notes that a shortage of hearses pressed a beer wagon into service, and that the demand for caskets kept carpenters busy 24 hours a day. This is a photograph that's courtesy of Special Collections and University Archives at Rutgers University. The situation in South River was so severe that in October of 1918, the Eastern Division of the Red Cross helped to set up an emergency hospital in a vacant embroidery factory. The hospital was laid out within a few hours and contained wards for men, women, and children, and had an immediate supply for 500 cots. By the third week of its opening, the hospital had 600 occupied cots and eventually treated over 800 patients. I do want to note that 2020 is the 100th anniversary of women's rights to vote. And I want to recognize in this slide the heroic contributions of women during the pandemic at a time when they couldn't vote. These were nameless women who helped out with the emergency Red Cross hospital at South River, who overnight set up a hospital, equipped it, staffed it around the clock, and provided an infrastructure to keep it operating under trying conditions. During the Morgan explosion, one gentleman who saw women relief workers as he passed through the wreckage of the factory and who was fearful of his own safety noted, and you can see the quote there on the left, "I saw these heroic women working here, there, and everywhere, giving absolutely no thought to their personal safety or comfort. All fear went out of my heart." And I want to recognize Dr. Sarah Evans Sellover, pictured on the bottom right, the lady doctor of South River, that during the pandemic treated over 450 patients, traveling around in her Model T Ford, checking in on the local population. A bank officer would say of Dr. Sellover that she doesn't know what fear is. The cemetery records do not exist for this void or for the entire burial ground. They were reputed to have been lost in a fire many decades ago. There is a surviving survey map that does survive and shows the section you see on the top left there, the open area, and the adjoining family plots that are in South River, which is laid out. You can see the names of the owners of those plots scribbled in. Aerial photographs dating back to the 1930s also show this section. And although it's hard to make out individual markers, there is certainly an open plot that stands in contrast to the other areas of the cemetery where groupings of monuments and markers are apparent. Now, the borough of South River let us look at their registrar records, and those records provided much information. The height of the pandemic was October of 1918. And to set some data points, we checked the records from October 1913, October 1914, October 1915, all the way through to 1921. So we looked at the flu years and then the non-flu years. The average number of deaths, non-flu years, was for October, averaged between 8 and 9 deaths for that month during the non-pandemic. During the pandemic, there were 69 recorded deaths, of which 59 can be directly connected to the influenza pandemic. If you look at the two charts I put up here, you can see the cause of death on the left, influenza, 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 pneumonia, pneumonia, and then on the right, the country of origin. And notice that it's very telling. Poland, Russia, Hungary, Austria, Russia, Austria. So again, giving really speaking to the cultural background of the folks in South River and those that were most impacted from this. Now, these records are good, but they're not perfect. Now, when examining the work that the South River Historical and Preservation Society has done, they've done a great job at examining newspapers, obituaries, oral histories, and newspaper articles. They've also cataloged the markers in Washington Monumental Cemetery, trying again to fill in that history. There are more deaths that are noted than in these registrar records. It also appears that the deaths in the emergency hospital may have not been included here as well. And what those numbers are difficult to ascertain. They seem to fluctuate also. And not to mention, other towns are also burying their dead in South River, especially places like neighboring Sayreville and East Brunswick as well. So we get back to the question of who were these folks that are buried here, and did they all die from the pandemic? What we can gather is that this section of the cemetery had been used for burials in the late 19th century for mainly an Eastern European immigrant population. What we know from the research is that the influenza pandemic had a heavy impact on South River and the surrounding communities, and it seems to have hit hard among the immigrant working class population, an impact that was further caused by refugees from the Morgan explosion, crowded housing that was fostered by a piecework system from the textile industries, as well as a transient population of war workers. Many of those deaths from the pandemic, no doubt, ended up in this section of Washington Monumental Cemetery. How many and where within the void is something we don't know, and unfortunately, we may never. But at the end of the day, what we have here is a story of an immigrant population, a population that was the backbone of the local labor force, a population that came to this country with their own set of cultural values that would be reflected in the landscape in South River today and within the burial ground. These folks had a mixed relationship with the established residents of South River, as they provided much needed labor for the local industries, but they also did not hesitate to rise up and protest over unfair working conditions and wages. The years before the 1918 pandemic, the population was involved in a series of strikes. And in South River, 2 workers were killed in one of those strikes. And in nearby Carteret, one of the worst strikes in New Jersey took place, in which 8 strikers were killed, and a newspaper quoting that they were shot down like dogs. And you can see that image on the upper right there of some of those injured workers in Carteret and their wives and children pictured below. These are the folks that took the brunt of the 1918 influenza pandemic. But whether they died from it or not, many ended up in this section of Washington Monumental Cemetery, mostly today lying unmarked in a section of the cemetery whose above ground forms of commemoration does not give a whole view of what lies buried beneath. Thank you.